We are looking at a document today that is supposed to be the ultimate compass for American foreign policy. But reading through the 2025 U.S. National Security Strategy, it feels a lot less like a compass and a lot more like a kaleidoscope. Depending on how you turn it, you either see a pragmatic withdrawal from global policing or a highly partisan, deeply self-contradictory manifesto.
A kaleidoscope is the exact right metaphor. Usually, these documents are incredibly dry, bureaucratic roadmaps. They are designed to tell the Pentagon and the State Department how to allocate resources. But this year, we're looking at a 33-page document that reads like a culture war battlefield, complete with warnings about civilizational erasure and a sudden, aggressive pivot away from Europe and straight into our own backyard.
Exactly. It is a fundamental rupture from the last 80 years of post-World War II consensus. We are talking about a strategy that essentially tells Europe to fend for itself, looks at China with a bizarre mix of economic intertwining and military skepticism, and dusts off the 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine to lock down the Western Hemisphere. So, let us break this down systematically. I want to run this through a MOST analysis first: mission, objectives, strategies, and tactics. What is the actual mission stated here?
The mission is unapologetically America first, but it has been redefined as hemispheric dominance and homeland security. The era of the United States acting as the ideological shield for global democracy is officially over. The mission is to insulate the American homeland from foreign threats, both military and cultural.
Which leads us to the objectives. If that is the mission, what are the concrete goals?
The primary objective is to secure the borders and eliminate any extra hemispheric influence in the Americas. We are talking about pushing Russia and China out of Latin America entirely. A secondary objective is to force wealthy allies, specifically in Europe, to assume the full financial and military burden of their own defense. And third, to maintain a favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific without stumbling into a catastrophic war.
And the strategies to achieve this? Because this is where I start seeing the contradictions.
The strategy is fascinating because it relies heavily on economic coercion and a massive military buildup in the Caribbean. The strategy dictates a withdrawal from the Middle East and a step back from NATO, while simultaneously preparing for potential regime change in places like Venezuela. It is a strategy of isolationism mixed with hyper-regional interventionism.
Which brings us to the tactics. How is this actually playing out on the ground?
Tactically, we are seeing the slashing of USAID by over 80%, the deployment of troops to Puerto Rico, and direct transactional negotiations with adversaries. But perhaps the most shocking tactic is the explicit political endorsement of far-right, nationalist political parties in Europe. The document actively criticizes mainstream European governments and sides with populist movements, which is a complete violation of traditional diplomatic norms.
It is staggering. We are essentially interfering in the domestic politics of our allies while demanding that our adversaries stay out of our hemisphere. Let us pivot this into a SWOT analysis. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Let us start with the strengths. Is there a genius to this madness?
There is a brutal pragmatism to it that you could argue is a strength. The document recognizes that the Cold War is over. Europe is incredibly wealthy. The European Union has a GDP rivaling China. The strength of this strategy is that it stops treating Europe like a shattered post-war continent and demands they pay for their own security. It also rightly identifies that the Western Hemisphere has massive, untapped economic potential if security issues like the cartels can be resolved.
But the weaknesses are glaring, right? You cannot just declare a new Monroe Doctrine without the willingness to enforce it.
Precisely. The biggest weakness is its inherent self-contradiction. The strategy rails against the forever wars of the Middle East, arguing they drained American blood and treasure. But enforcing the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America, getting involved in the domestic politics of Venezuela, or combating cartels is the exact recipe for a new generation of forever wars. Civil wars in the Americas last a decade on average. You cannot be a non-interventionist while simultaneously launching strikes in your own hemisphere.
What about the opportunities here? If we look past the partisan rhetoric, where is the strategic upside?
The opportunity lies in a potential pragmatic détente with China. Both the US and China are deeply intertwined economically. China is facing severe domestic economic headwinds and cannot afford a war over Taiwan, and the US has no desire to fight a naval war in the Pacific. The strategy leaves the door open for a transactional peace, where military posturing is dialed down in exchange for economic stability.
But that brings us to the threats. And the threats seem existential.
The immediate threat is the collapse of Ukraine and the destabilization of Eastern Europe. If the US pulls its security umbrella back, Russia is emboldened. But the deeper threat is the total loss of American soft power. By alienating our democratic allies, treating them purely as transactional burdens, and openly embracing anti-democratic factions, the US creates a vacuum. And historically, when the US leaves a vacuum, powers like China and Russia are more than happy to fill it.
Let us slice this even thinner. I want to look at this through a spear framework: security, political, economic, alliances, and resources. Starting with security.
Security is no longer defined by forward deployment in the Eastern Hemisphere. It is defined by border control and hemispheric dominance. The strategy equates immigration and border crossings with national security threats, using words like invasion. It is a fortress mentality.
And the political dimension? Because this might be the most unusual aspect of the entire report.
It is incredibly unusual. The political dimension is essentially the domestic culture war exported abroad. The text uses terms like civilizational erasure to describe demographic changes in Europe and the US. It attacks diversity initiatives and climate change. It is using a national security document to litigate domestic partisan grievances, which signals to the rest of the world that American foreign policy is no longer stable, but subject to the wild swings of our internal politics.
Moving to the economic pillar. Trade seems to be viewed entirely as a weapon now.
Yes, but a weapon meant to rebuild the domestic industrial base. The strategy assumes that past assumptions about free trade democratizing China were a complete failure. Now, the economic goal is decoupling in critical tech sectors, enforcing heavy tariffs, and using market access to force geopolitical concessions.
What about alliances? We touched on Europe, but what is the broader philosophy here?
The philosophy is that alliances are liabilities unless they pay immediate dividends. The document actively questions whether future NATO members will even share American values. It is a shift from shared ideological alliances to purely transactional partnerships. We will work with autocrats in the Middle East without judging their governance, but we will harshly judge the domestic policies of democratic Europe.
Finally, resources. How does this strategy allocate the actual machinery of government?
By gutting soft power resources like US aid and shifting capital toward a massive defense industrial base buildup. But crucially, that buildup is not for fighting insurgents in the desert. It is for high-tech, industrial warfare deterrence against China, while shifting naval and troop assets to the Caribbean.
So, taking all of this together, the MOST, the SWOT, the SPEAR frameworks, what are the full implications of this report? If I am a foreign leader reading this, or an intelligence analyst sitting at a desk in Washington, what is the ultimate takeaway?
The full implication is that the global operating system we have known since 1945 is being uninstalled. The United States is formally resigning as the global policeman. If you are in Europe, the implication is terrifying. You are entirely on your own, and the US might actually support the political factions trying to dismantle your governments from the inside.
And if you are in Beijing or Moscow?
If you are in Moscow, you are thrilled. The US is signaling an equidistant stance on Ukraine, essentially treating the war as a European nuisance rather than a threat to global order. If you are in Beijing, you see a massive opportunity. The US is withdrawing from the global south by cutting aid, leaving a massive vacuum for Chinese infrastructure and influence to move in.
But there is a catch for Beijing too, right? Because the US is also explicitly stating it will not allow China to dominate the Indo-Pacific.
Exactly. The implication for China is a paradox. The US wants to avoid war and trade with them, but is simultaneously supercharging its defense industrial base to ensure China can never break out of the first island chain.
What about the implications for the American public? Because ultimately, this strategy is written in their name.
The implication for the American public is a promise of less foreign entanglement, but at the cost of potential conflict right on our doorstep. By drawing a hard line around the Western Hemisphere, the U.S. is committing to policing the Americas. If a government in Latin America aligns too closely with China or Russia, this strategy implies the U.S. will intervene. We are trading the sands of the Middle East for the jungles of South America.
It is a profound shift. It forces us to ask a deeply philosophical question about the nature of power. Can a superpower truly retreat to its own hemisphere in a globally interconnected world? If you step back from the world stage, does the world simply leave you alone? Or does the chaos eventually follow you home?
That is the ultimate gamble of this strategy. It assumes that the oceans will protect us, just as they did a century ago. But in an era of cyber warfare, global supply chains, and hypersonic weapons, the idea of a hemispheric fortress might be an illusion. You can build the walls as high as you want, but you cannot lock out the 21st century.
A fortress is only as strong as the world it isolates itself from. This document is not just a policy shift. It is a mirror reflecting a deeply divided nation trying to figure out what its role is supposed to be. It leaves us with a lingering suspense. Will this strategy secure the homeland, or will it simply invite the very global instability it is trying to avoid? We will have to watch the map to find out.